Hi, welcome to Claire in Context, the life and times of Claire of Assisi. I'm your guide, Joni. Claire is best known as a saint, but I'm going to focus today on her history and what we can take away from that history. Stories you may have already heard about Saint Claire come from hagiography, which is written with the agenda of either getting someone canonized as a saint or presenting them as someone to imitate. When you look at Claire's history compared to her hagiography, you kind of get different pictures. In the medieval stories about her, she's presented as docile and a paragon of medieval femininity. From her writings and her history, though, you get a sense of her defiant streak. And if you haven't heard of Claire of Assisi, she's known for her close relationship to Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan Order of Monks, and for founding a women's Franciscan order herself. These were centered around a strict rule of poverty. But first, let's zoom out. I don't know what your education on the medieval period was like, but mine was crunched. You had the Roman Empire, and then the Middle Ages, something about decline and feudalism, and then the glorious Renaissance, as if the Middle Ages were all about decline. And that's not quite true. So let's talk about the 13th century. The 13th century was a time of spiritual renewal because in the last couple of centuries, the church was rocked with scandals of abuses around power and wealth, things like buying positions in the church. And since there's no really dominant kingdom or kingdoms in Europe at this time, the Roman Catholic Church was the most powerful institution. It was deeply entrenched in the political world. There's no such thing as separation of church and state. And at the same time, Europe is undergoing a really significant economic shift. So much wealth is coming in from the Crusades that owning land is no longer the only way to be wealthy. People with money, capital, can get access to power. This is the point where capitalism really starts to develop. And this allows the working class to emerge, people who sell their labor for wages. Work changed from something you do to survive to something you did to get more money. And this raises significant questions for Christians about how to live faithful lives under the new system. Now, I promised you spiritual renewal. It's not all money and abuse. There is a surge of new expressions of faith, many of which were in direct response to the issue of rising wealth and even in resistance to it. But before we get to that, let's take a look at traditional monasticism. Europe at this time had a lot of conformity in monastic life, and it was primarily Benedictine, which focuses on silence, order, and humility. And monasticism at Europe in this point had already gone through a wave of reform. Monasteries could amass large amounts of wealth, land, and become engaged in church abuses. There was also an element here where noble children would go into monasteries and kind of expect to keep living a noble lifestyle. Claire's life, as we'll see, is a significant departure from this. So in contrast to traditional monasticism, there are a few popular movements in the 13th century, and a little before, that the church was concerned about. One is known as the Waldensians, who saw the monks and bishops as corrupt and engaged in itinerant preaching. They were rejected as heretics, largely for their refusal to recognize church authority. And then there were the Beguines, which were a movement of lay women and men, who were called Begards, who didn't marry and lived together in same-sex houses of mutual spiritual encouragement. They were controversial because they didn't live according to an established monastic rule or enclosed in a convent. They continued working and lived in the community. And the Cathars, on the other hand, were like heresy. They believed that there were two gods, the good God of the New Testament and the evil God of this age, Satan, sometimes. So the church is really concerned about Catharism. And in response, they approve a few new monastic orders, even though that had been banned at this time. That's how much pressure these movements are putting on the church institution that they really want to add their own new monastic orders that are kind of bastions of orthodoxy, because heresy can rise up in popular movements. The Dominicans were founded by Dominic Guzman, Saint Dominic, who saw good preaching as the solution to the popularity of the Waldensians and Cathars. He began a career of itinerant preaching, and that's what the Dominican order is focused on. They're a mendicant order, which means that they beg for a living. And then we have the Franciscans, who are also a mendicant order, and even the community could not own property. This is what Claire is really drawn to. Both of these orders lived inserted in the community rather than apart from it, which is a pretty significant departure from traditional monasticism, and you can see the influence there of the Beguines and the Waldensians who were embedded in their community. And of course, the Franciscans were founded by Francis of Assisi. Francis is the most significant relationship in Clare's life. He is her inspiration. His focus was on living like Jesus through the renunciation of wealth. While Francis today is best known for care of creation and for loving animals, what he was really about was following Jesus through poverty. And that is precisely what inspired Clare. So now that we know about the world Clare was living in, let's talk about her. Clare was born to an extremely wealthy family in 1193. Hagiography tells us that Clare was compassionate toward the poor from a young age, hiding portions of her food to donate later. One of the most impactful events of her life is meeting Francis, which happens sometime before she's 18, but it's not really clear how. One of Clare's blood sisters claimed that Francis had already heard of Clare's piety and sought her out, but the hagiographers all report that Clare sought Francis out. It's not clear if one is just Clare's sister gassing her up, or if the other is hagiographers trying to tell a more palatable and sanitized story. We just don't know. But at any rate, they meet, they become close, and Clare had a lot of admiration for Francis. There are a couple things in her life that she only does out of obedience to him, and that's pretty profound because we'll see later who she's willing to defy. As for Francis, this is really his only significant friendship with a woman. He reportedly refused to look at women unless he considered them brothers. So this friendship must have developed while Clare was still at home, because Francis helps her escape. And I do mean escape. At age 18, Clare snuck out of her home at night, and she and Francis fled to a small rural chapel, where he tonsured her hair. Her family sends men, knights from her household, to retrieve her, and it's when she bears her tonsured head that they allow her to enter religious life. First, she goes to a Benedictine convent, but this isn't permanent. What Clare really wants is to follow Francis in complete poverty. So to this end, she divests herself of her inheritance, which would have been significant. Women were allowed to inherit at this time, especially Clare, because she had no brothers. So this wasn't just dowry money. She would have inherited quite a bit. And rather than that being given to the convent that she entered, which is the more traditional path, she gives it to the poor, against her family's wishes. They tried to buy it back from her, and she refused. Her writing indicates that she was concerned they were going to defraud the poor, and she really wanted to make sure the money was donated. Land, probably. Francis builds a small house in San Damiano for Clare, or has it built, and her blood sister Agnes, who joined her about 2 weeks after Clare's conversion, and Clare moves there from the Benedictine house. Other women join, mostly women who know Clare, especially in the early years. Eventually, her other blood sister and her mother join her. Clare lives the rest of her life in San Damiano, where she and her community are known as the Poor Ladies of San Damiano. The major work of Clare's life is San Damiano itself, and the rule for her order. She never wanted to be abbess, but she accepted that role in obedience to Francis. I think it's pretty clear that she would always have been the leader of San Damiano, but she had a more egalitarian view of leadership and just didn't want the clout that came with that title. Overall, she had a very specific vision for her religious life that she was unwavering on, and it was work to get it. Clare didn't want to live under an existing monastic rule, which wouldn't have provisions for the poverty she intended. She had to receive a privilege of poverty from the Pope, which was completely new at the time. The Pope granted it, according to Clare, when he saw how little she and her sisters feared poverty and how much joy they found in it. Now, this poverty was controversial. Franciscan men went out and begged for a living, but no one considered it safe for the ladies of San Damiano to do that. Francis promised her that the men's order would provide for hers, but everyone was still really concerned about the poverty Clare was living in. She lived in such an intense poverty that she really didn't even eat very much, and was eventually ordered by Francis to eat daily, and only did it in obedience to him. She ate so little that she spent much of her life very ill. And this isn't something that she holds her other sisters to. There are provisions in the rule for sisters who are ill. This is her refusal. And the other controversial element of San Damiano is that it was not cloistered during Claire's life. It's not clear how much Claire actually left San Damiano, especially since she was often ill, but it is clear that Claire felt she was able to leave and that this is what she wanted for her order. And during her life, she maintained that, although the order was enclosed after her death, which kind of indicates how much work she had to put in during her life to live the life that she wanted. But what Claire really wanted was a rule. She wrote the rule for her order herself, and it was the first rule by a woman approved by the Pope. She got the news that it was approved the day before she died. So right at the end of her life, this order that she's worked for her whole life is finally secured. In addition to the order, Claire left behind a little bit of writing. Some of it's contested, but it seems generally accepted that she wrote a testament and 4 letters to Agnes of Prague. The letters are very interesting because, for one thing, Agnes and Claire never got to meet in real life. Even getting letters back and forth was hard. Claire apologized for not writing more in one letter, noting that it was difficult to find a messenger and how dangerous the roads were. But the two still had a very deep connection, and in one letter, Claire called Agnes the other half of her soul. And I just think that's a fun detail because I'm sharing this on Tumblr, and I think a lot of us have friendships like this. I know I have a few significant relationships with people that I met on Tumblr and I have never seen in real life. So Agnes was another wealthy woman who sold her possessions and gave to the poor to enter monastic life. She sought advice from Claire, and Claire guided and encouraged her in living the same sort of poverty that Claire did. Claire even advised her on how to deal with those who were against her entering this poverty, including someone so powerful that Claire doesn't name him and just writes around his identity, possibly a cardinal. She even indicated in her writing a willingness to defy the Pope because she believed that her call came from God. So again, the fact that she did things simply out of obedience to Francis really shows what high esteem she held him in and how much she saw his way of life as a call from God. The writing is also where we see a lot of Claire's mysticism. Claire believed that divinity was enfleshed in her being, and this allowed her to endure even great suffering with joy. Claire's life was about kenosis, seeking to imitate the emptying out, that's what kenosis means, of Christ on the cross. Claire wanted to be poor because Christ was poor on earth, and because she believed that it was a path that led to love. In the emptying out of poverty, Claire sought to free herself from all of her attachments except love. So why talk about Claire now? First of all, I was really drawn to Claire's expression of faith during the onset of capitalism as someone who lives 800 years later under the same system. These movements popped up in response to a question of how to be faithful in a world that really worships wealth. And Claire is an example of a really specific response that we can't necessarily imitate today, although you can join the poor Claires. But the questions that permeate her era remain. What do we do about wealth? What do we do with wealth? What do we do about the grind, the hustle? How do I keep from idolizing wealth? And I don't really have the answer to these questions because I'm never satisfied with my own practice here. In the words of one of my favorite rappers, POS, I can't give enough away to salvage what is truly great. So Claire's fearlessness in answering these questions is really astounding. And the other thing that I find really compelling about Claire is her extreme commitment to poverty, even at the expense of her health. I think that's really difficult for us to understand from a modern perspective, especially since modern culture, at least in the US, but I think other places, really connects health and morality. But I come back to one line from Professor Celia Corey that Claire knew that spiritual fruitfulness is possible even amidst immense suffering. Even though she was bedridden for much of her time at San Damiano, she still led that community and she still had this really fruitful relationship with Agnes. And that's a great reminder for all of us that disabled lives are fruitful. And finally, Claire lived a really singular and autonomous life, following God's call when it would have been much easier to live in a culturally normative way. And we aren't necessarily called to imitate Claire by giving up all of our possessions, but her life is a really rich text on what it means to follow God's call and live out who God is calling us to be, even when others don't understand. So thanks for joining me to talk about Clare. I have a lot more information that didn't make it into the presentation, so if you want to chat about Clare, come chat with me. And I would love to hear what you take away from Clare for your faith, or if you have experience engaging with her spiritually as a saint. I don't, because I'm Lutheran, and that's not part of my culture. Or if you learned anything new, let me know, or if you hated this and want to fight me, please leave it in the replies. Thanks.